of reminder, we spent some time yesterday as we began discussing this whole guilt, shame, and fear dynamic. We took a brief look at how different cultures deal with this. We reminded ourselves of 10 important truths so that as we enter this difficult discussion, we're reminded how much we're loved, how much God values us, and those sorts of things. We then looked at Genesis 1 and 2 and discovered things like that God is not a part of nature. He created it freely as an act of His will, that the world is good, that the universe has order, that when God brings order, what comes with it is peace, that human beings are the ones who create the chaos. And then we looked at Genesis 3, where the rebellion of Adam and Eve led to a split of the domestic and dominion mandates. It led to slavery for both Adam and Eve, Adam to the ground, Eve to Adam. And it led to a breakdown in all their relationships. And then we saw how God responded by seeking them, right? Yeah. And then forgiving, honoring, loving, and sending. All those dynamics to realize that God was not going to allow their rebellion to be the final word. And what that does now is help us understand that the presence of guilt, shame, and fear is now a normal part of our experience as human beings because of the fall. And consequently, when we think about the gospel, we have to take those three things into account. And it's interesting because in the United States, for example, almost all the time, when the cross is talked about or Jesus' ministry, guilt is what's discussed. How can I be forgiven? But there's still shame and fear that have to be dealt with. Yes. Or maybe if you're in Asia, they'll be dealing with, I've heard from a gentleman from Nepal, I think it was, who talked about the shame issue. They talk about it all the time when they talk about the cross. Hardly ever talk about the guilt. And then in Africa, this whole issue of fear, right? How do we deal with that? The fear of death, the fear of ancestral spirits, and all those issues. So wherever we live, whoever we are, all three are operating, and our culture tries to deal with it apart from God. That's the key. And what we learned in Genesis 3 is that trying to deal with it apart from God doesn't work. The solution is what God does, not what we do. Does that make sense? So that's where we are now. And so what we're going to do is shift now into discussing specifically guilt, shame, and fear. We're going to begin this morning with definitions, then look at some unhelpful attitudes about them, and then look at where these things come from in our lives. So let's get started, huh?
Yes.
So let's define guilt. What is guilt? Well, I just used dictionary definitions, and then we'll talk a little more. The fact or state of having committed a breach of conduct, right? Could be an offense, could be a crime, a violation, a wrong, especially violating moral or penal law, and or missing the bullseye, falling short, and involving a penalty. In other words, guilt is not a feeling, it's a reality.
Yeah.
This is just very important. We often talk about guilt in terms of the feeling, and certainly guilt can have guilt feelings, right? We've all experienced the feeling. But the presence of real guilt is not dependent on whether the feeling's there. There are people who are very guilty who don't feel it at all. They're sociopaths. They murder people and they ask, "Do you feel guilty?" About what? I feel great. So this isn't a feeling. This is a state of being. This is a reality. I did this, or I should have done that, right? So you can be guilty of doing. You can also be guilty of not doing, right? So if, for example, a fireman fails to run into the fire to rescue someone, we would say, "Oh, that man is guilty. He didn't fulfill his duty." But also, if someone steals or violates a family code, right, these issues become moral or penal, and they're not always. There are things that are not illegal that are still immoral. There's not a law that covers everything. And there are things that are not immoral, but they're illegal. And so this whole guilt issue can become a bit confusing. But here's what I want you to get. The essence of guilt is, I did something wrong. I did something wrong. Either by committing or omitting. I did something wrong. We say things like, I was mistaken, I erred, I broke the law, I'm guilty. And the interesting thing about guilt is still a relational word, because when we're talking about guilt, we're often thinking, how can I make it right with others? If I mistreat my daughter, I'm thinking, I better apologize. I better seek reconciliation. I'm still thinking of the other person. And in that regard, guilt is not an anti-relational word. It's a word that can spur us to reaching out to the one we have wronged so that the relationship can be healed. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And what we're really asking when we're talking about guilt is we use words like forgive me. I used to tell people all the time when I was a pastor, if you want to apologize, this is what you say. I'm sorry. I was wrong. Please forgive me. And don't put a comma with but afterwards. I was wrong. Please forgive me. But I was under a lot of stress, which means I'm not really apologizing. I'm excusing. When we want to be forgiven, we were wrong. I did something wrong. I want to make it right between us. Does that make sense to you when we talk about guilt?
Yes.
And the realization that it's moral or penal or both, right? Psalm 32:5, David, then I acknowledged my sin to you, did not cover my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. David wasn't talking about his feelings. He didn't say, God erased my feelings about my sin. He said, you forgave the guilt, the real moral guilt. I did something wrong. And of course, as Christians, we recognize that the something wrong is anything that violates the character, nature, and purpose of God. Right? That's the measuring stick, right? Because all of God's laws, say the Ten Commandments, reflect his nature. And they reflect the nature of the world he created. So when we violate them, we're violating God and we're violating our own created order. That's guilt. Right? Are you with me on that?
Yes.
So there we are with guilt, and it just sits there, and it can be dealt with or not dealt with, but it's real. But then we come to shame. Shame is different than guilt. And in shame's case, it's defined as a painful emotion caused by the consciousness of guilt or falling short or social impropriety. It's a condition of humiliating disgrace or disrepute. This is key, because of my actions, yes, but also could be my associations or the actions of others. It's, for example, if in my family my brother commits a crime and goes to prison, I did nothing wrong. I'm not guilty, but I could still feel shame.
Yeah.
Are you with me? So relationally, we're connected. It happens in families, marriages, even clans, tribes. This feeling of collective shame.
It's disgrace.
Disgrace. Yeah. And so we have to hang our head. My family was disgraced by the behavior of my uncle. Right? Now, here's the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt says I did something wrong. Shame says I am something wrong.
I am?
I am something wrong. Guilt says I did something wrong. Shame, now it becomes, no, I am something wrong. See? Abby talked about being. At the core of my being, I'm something wrong. That's what shame is saying. My family, we are something wrong. Not we did something wrong, but now it's that family, that man. And we all know people who their whole life carry that shame. Everybody identifies them as that man. What are they saying? There's something in him. There's nothing he can do about it. I am something wrong. And in that regard, shame is anti-relational because it causes us to turn into ourselves away from people.
Yes.
Guilt still has that relational aspect. I'm sorry, I want to make it right, brother. Shame says, I'm no good, right? I'm an outcast. I'm worthless. I'm dishonorable. I'm dung, right? It turns us away from others. And at its heart cry, those who are stuck in shame is not forgive me, it's accept me. I wish I were accepted. Abby mentioned that in her testimony when she was 12 years. When she heard that God accepted her before she did anything, and what she was really saying was, in my shame, I found out I was loved and accepted, and I could respond then. That's why when the church uses shame against people, what they're really being is anti-relational. Right? And you've all heard preaching like that. It's the finger pointing. You people, you should be ashamed. Well, the moment that happens, it's a turning inward. There's something wrong with me, not with what I did, but with me. Right? When we talk about the symptoms that show up, it'll become even more clear. So you see the difference between guilt and shame?
Yes.
I did something wrong, now it's I am something wrong. Well, that's very different. Hebrews 2:11 says, both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. Do you see how shame is now connected to the family? And Jesus isn't ashamed? Wow. Well, if Jesus isn't ashamed of me, then why am I ashamed of myself? But we struggle with that, don't we? We struggle with that. So that's shame. Any questions at this point about what we're discussing with guilt and shame? We're just defining, just kind of getting our hands around. Are we together on this?
Yes.
All right, let's go to fear. Well, fear is an unpleasant, you know this, often strong emotion caused by the anticipation, belief, or awareness of someone or something is dangerous, is likely to cause us pain, or is a threat to us. At its core, guilt is I did something wrong. Shame is I am something wrong. Fear, I deserve to be punished. I deserve to be punished. Right? At its core, I'm powerless. My future is painful. I'm damned. And just like shame, fear is anti-relational. It causes us to hide. And when we hide, we can't be in relationship. Just like shame causes us to turn inward, fear causes us to hide. At its core, those who are afraid are saying, love me. Right? Adam and Eve hid because they were afraid God would punish them. Right? 1 John 4:18. There is no fear in love. Think about that. There is no fear in love. But perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with what? Punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. So there you have the three. Guilt, I did something wrong. Shame, I am something wrong. Fear, I deserve to be punished. I'm damned. Right? And those three operate sometimes together sometimes one or two dominate, right? And I read an amazing quote once by a chaplain who worked in a mental health prison. These were all people who were put in prison for terrible crimes, but they were mentally ill. This was a quote. I don't have it written here. Half the people in the facility could be let out tomorrow if they believed they were forgiven, if their shame was dealt with. That the guilt, shame, and fear had so dominated their lives, they can't function.
Yeah.
They can't relate. They're crazy. And so each person, we like to say in the States, everybody's a little crazy. And in this regard, it's true, because we all deal with guilt, shame, and fear in our lives.
Yes.
All of us. And so remember, guilt, I did something wrong. It's still relational. I want to make it right? Mm-hmm. Shame, I am something wrong, anti-relational. I turn in on myself. And fear, anti-relational. I fear punishment, I'm damned, and I hide. And we mentioned even hiding in plain sight, right? Some people are hiding even in your presence, because the person they're giving you isn't the real person. Okay, any questions about those three? Yes, Nathan.
Your mic has been unclipped.
Let me fix it. Here, I thought you were going to give me a provocative theological question.
I have a question.
Yes.
There's a scenario, our brother, the one who was driving us,
Okay.
has been driving us down the Nangush.
Okay.
So he decided to divorce his wife
Yeah.
because of other things done. And at this time is afraid to come
Yes.
to church, but I'm busy just trying to follow him up, to encourage him to bring him back. So, but it's like he's ashamed to be in the church.
Well, yes.
So how best can I help?
Well, that's at the end of the teaching. We're going to talk about that. Let me give a general response. We'll talk about specific strategies later.
Yes.
Remember I quoted Jesus scorned the shame of the cross?
Yes.
Shame has to be scorned. By that, I mean it has to be exposed. There's no way to help someone who's ashamed it sounds like he has something to be ashamed of. Okay. There is moral guilt, is there?
Yes.
Okay. Therefore, the shame, but it has turned him inward, right?
Yes.
Because now he's hiding. You see how it works?
Yeah.
The moral guilt has to be dealt with, and then the shame, and then the fear. And the real question is whether he's willing to deal with the moral guilt. Sometimes people who are stuck in shame refuse to deal with it. I did nothing wrong. I have no reason to be ashamed. You go, well, now, wait a minute. In this case, you did do something wrong. And then the shame has to be dealt with by exposure. And we're going to talk about it by re-remembering my life. Just hold on to that. Don't ask me what it means, because you'll find out later.
Yes.
And then the fear has to be dealt with by confronting it, right? So, and all of that in the church should be done with the help of others.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to become so isolated, and then we cannot function.
Mm-hmm.
So to ask someone who's dealing with shame to sort of, shake it off, deal with it, it's not helpful. So your desire to be with the brother, to walk him through the process, is important.
Yes.
If he's repentant about the moral guilt, then you can move forward and start dealing with the shame. And it's going to be tough, right? Because the community, the broader community, may not applaud you,
Yeah.
right?
Definitely.
Why are you going with that brother? You know what he did was wrong. Well, yes, I know that. It's all been acknowledged. But here we are a year later, and the man has to live. Restoration. Even Peter was restored, right?
Yes, yes.
And so, does that make sense, the general feeling? So,
Yes.
so we'll talk about how that happens. And we'll also talk about the fact that sometimes the church is the very place where people refuse to deal with these things. And they make it worse. They want people to be ashamed. They live there themselves, right? We say misery loves company. Drunks like to drink with others. Shameful people, let's all be ashamed, right? So we live in that atmosphere of shame. There's no grace. But remember, God pursues, God forgives, God honors, God loves. Those are our clues. You're pursuing. You have to help him through the forgiveness and then the honoring. That's what's hard. Why should we honor this man? There's nothing good about him. Say, in himself now, he has no value. But that's a lie. That's a lie. There's something he can be honored for. You have to find what it is.
Yes.
And then this fear issue has to be dealt with love, not with power. It's a process. It's sort of like what happens to a rape victim. They feel guilty. They did nothing wrong. But the guilt's real. They have this survivor's guilt thing, this rape survivor, and the shame that comes with it, and then the community. Well, she must have done something, right? I saw that girl. She was wearing that short dress. See? So she deserved it? Is that what we're saying? What are we saying? But people who walk through the process with a victim like that find that it isn't quick. It takes courage to walk with people, because you risk being rejected by the very community that should be the place of healing. Isn't that true?
Yes.
The very place that healing should occur becomes the place of keeping the wound open and pouring salt in the wound. And often those who have not dealt with their own shame are the worst. Because they're covering. Right. There's an old saying among pastors in the United States, when you're called to a church that's been in existence, the person to be afraid of is the person who approaches you first in the new congregation. Oh, pastor, welcome to our church. They're always trouble.
Yes.
Sure, they're covering their shame. Always. It's that person. Comes up after the first sermon. Oh, pastor. Just be careful. Be careful. So that's an answer without an answer.
It's an answer.
But it's so as we move through this training,
Yes.
towards the end will be, now what do we do about these three things in the church?
Yes.
I think you'll find it helpful. But you'll pay a price, brother. You'll pay a price. But let him who is without sin throw the first stone. Huh?
Wow. None.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, from the oldest to the youngest, they put the stones down. All right, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some, I say unhelpful or unhealthy attitudes that start to swirl around us when we have guilt, shame, or fear, all right? With regard to guilt, this idea that I'm a victim, that someone else is to blame, and therefore I am still in the right, right? Yeah, I may have done that, but I had a reason for doing that. It's not my fault. Brother so-and-so was rude, and so I punched him in the nose. You say, well, yes, he was rude, but you shouldn't have punched him in the nose. Well, I had every reason to punch him in the nose. Why should you blame me? I said, well, that attitude's not helpful. It doesn't solve anything. Yeah. It doesn't solve your guilt. It doesn't solve the relational break. It doesn't pay the price for that. But people do that all the time. Pastor, you have to understand. I literally had a man over the winter ask to meet with me. I had walked with him and his wife for years to bring them to Christ. then to deal with their sexuality because they were committing sexual sin. They were not married. They repented. We taught. We trained. I married them. Now, years later, he's committing adultery. He asked to speak with me. Here's what he said. I don't feel bad about what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. I have strong physical needs for frequent sex, and my wife does not. It's really her fault that I'm sleeping around.
Wow.
What do I do with that? I said, well, if you're willing to face the insanity of what you're saying, if you're willing to face your moral guilt, I'll meet with you. I said, call me if you want to meet again. He never called. He's now divorced his wife. These are two people I led to Christ. Abby and I ran into the wife, and she's just like, there's nothing you can do with that. See, it's not his fault. His wife wouldn't sleep with him often enough. Therefore, he had no choice but to commit adultery, you see. So really, she's to blame. Not helpful. How's another one? I demand that you respect me. I must vindicate myself. It's an attempt to self-justify, right? Now, you see people try to do this. Sometimes people who work hardest in the church are working out of this guilt, right? They're very busy in the church. See me, I'm a faithful Christian. I read the Bible, I pray, my knees are sore from praying. Okay, why are you doing this? Well, sometimes they do it because they love Jesus and they love the church, but that's not often. It's not why they're doing it. Mm. They've got unresolved moral guilt, and they think they can justify themselves by behaving or acting or serving or working or tithing or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Those are dangerous people in the church too. Because you cross those people. And then there's this, I must try harder. Some people say, I failed. I'll try harder next time not to fail. Well, that doesn't solve the problem of the failure, you see. It's like a man who commits adultery and then says, okay, I've stopped. I'm going to try harder not to do it in the future. Yes, but we haven't yet dealt with the adultery. Yes. You see. We haven't yet dealt with it. Oh, I'm okay. That's in the past. Say, I'm okay. No, you're not okay. Mm-hmm. Right? So all of these, none of these attitudes is helpful when it comes to guilt. Here's the attitude that's helpful. I did something wrong. I need forgiveness. What do I have to do to resolve it? I'm going to reach out to the person I wronged. I'm going to figure out a way to make it right in that. But I can't fix it by I can't fix the bad thing by doing right things. Mm. Forgiveness is the solution to guilt. Not self-justification, not self-vindication, not trying harder. Forgiveness is the only solution. Are you with me on this? This is very different if you're not careful. And the church speaks forgiveness but behaves otherwise. Yeah. And you got people running around doing all these things out of guilt. They're not being motivated by love. They're not being motivated by affection for Christ. It's not growing out of a flowing of the Holy Spirit. It's, I keep screwing up. I better, they show up early for prayer meeting, but truthfully, their insides are all screwed up with this guilt. It's unresolved. So they're leading prayer meeting, but they haven't spoke to their brother in 4 years. Unresolved guilt. Are you with me? You see what happens? Yes. We do it all the time.
That we are with you. There is a situation whereby someone has committed adultery.
Yes.
It's a couple, okay, let me put it that way. And then the husband is trying to bring that person so that there should be forgiveness.
Yes.
And then the wife says, no, me, I'm not guilty. And then in the process of that wife tries to do better things, thinking that
See? And none of it solves it. because the only solution to guilt is forgiveness, and the only one who can give the ultimate forgiveness is Christ. So we have to deal with God, and we have to deal with the person we've offended, and nobody wants to do that because we have to say I was wrong. Not I was wrong, but no, I was wrong.
But
no buts.
But no but.
But me, no buts.
but is our culture. To say
Is it?
it's only self-defense, like you're saying. Yes.
Yeah.
Say you wouldn't love just to accept you have done it. Say, but
I did this because of this. Just like in the Garden of Eden.
But the woman you gave me. But the devil. But.
Wow.
If the word but is at the end of the sentence, they have not yet dealt with their guilt. I have not yet dealt with my guilt. Period. And I will tell you that those who seek to vindicate themselves, to justify themselves, to solve their guilt problem, ultimately will become a problem for themselves, for their families, and for the church. Elders, particularly, who are driven by guilt, become ruthless elders. Very intolerant of other people's failures. Oh, I don't know why everyone can't be early to prayer meeting like I am. If you really love the Lord, you'd be tithing like I tithe. See? All those games. The man looks on outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. So we're not dealing with the heart issue of guilt. We're dealing with all these other silly things. And let me tell you, if you are a bad pastor, you can use guilt to control your people and to get a lot of stuff done. You got all these guilty people running around sweeping the church, putting the flowers out, carrying the Bibles, going on door-to-door evangelism, man. Everybody's being driven by guilt, but nobody's being driven by love. It looks good, but it isn't good. So, unhealthy attitudes about guilt. That's enough to feel depressed already, isn't it? Now, how about shame? Here's some unhealthy attitudes about shame. I must be admired. Secretly, I'm special. It's a strange response to shame. People who are ashamed sometimes demand that you must acknowledge they're special. I'll give you a perfect example of this. I see it all the time. It's particularly prevalent in sexual sin cases. I don't know why. Maybe because sex is so personal, right? Even the Apostle Paul says, having relations with a prostitute, you become one with the prostitute. It's real. People who are ashamed of their sexual behavior sometimes like to turn that into something special. It's not that there's anything wrong with me. My lesbian relationship makes me special. I'm a special person. God made me this way, you see. Okay. Well, okay. Well, you're not special. No one is special. In a way, everyone is special, right? God created each of us. So this notion that I'm special, that there's something about me that sets me apart from others, and because I'm special, you must treat me more gently, you must treat me more carefully, you must make sure you don't offend me. Well, that isn't helpful. Because that doesn't solve shame issues, right? So people who carry shame, either because of what they've done, family sin, could be anything. Doesn't work. Neither does this sense of I'm going to promote myself. Applaud me. I'm always interested in actors and actresses. Often when you read about their lives, they're driven by this desperate need for applause. You hear them say it. Oh, there's nothing like being on stage and feeling the energy of the crowd. And when they cheer for me, that's when I feel whole.
Wow.
You go, okay, well, you're in big trouble. because the desire to be acclaimed is a cover-up for shame in almost every case. And then you start reading about how they were raised. They have a broken relationship with their father. They were raised in poverty. They've come out of this, and I'm thinking, what is driving them? Very different when you hear an actor or actress say, I love the characters. It's such a joy to be able to present a beautiful story to somebody. That's different than, I love the applause. In both cases, the acting could be great, but one is motivated by the desire for applause, and the other by the desire for art. It's a very different motivation. Well, I can't sanctify myself. I can't promote myself out of my shame, and I can't honor myself out of my shame. I can't seeking status. I want to be smarter. I want to be acclaimed. I want to gain status. None of that deals with the fact that inside me, I am something wrong. That stays with me. And of course, we see this in the church a lot. People who need to be thanked whenever they do something for the church. They drive you crazy. I don't mean to suggest we shouldn't thank people, but you know what I mean. They seek thanks. They become angry if they're not thanked. And they want, that's right. And so if you don't mention their name from the front of the church, but you mention someone else's name, right? Why did you mention Brother Smith, but you didn't mention me, Pastor? I was here sweeping. I cooked the fish. I did this. Well, okay. I mean, everybody did something, right? So we're going to mention everybody at every service? What are we going to do? Get down the aisle? I noticed this. I can tell the difference in this culture with regard to shame and honor, because of you have to acknowledge everybody's presence at the beginning of any meeting, or everybody gets upset. And today we welcome Pastor Doug and Abby all the way from America. Yay! And we have Pastor Martin. Martin is here. He's come from here. And blah, blah, blah. And we have then the front row. By the time you're to the third row, I'm still waiting for the sermon. What are we doing? Are we here to honor Christ or honor each other? What are we doing? So that's a cultural thing. Yeah. I'm teasing. Yeah, so my point is, I go, there's an honor-shame thing going on in this culture that doesn't go on in my culture. In my culture, it's brief. Ladies and gentlemen, we're so grateful. Thank you to so-and-so for inviting. Thanks so much. We don't have them stand. Nobody cheer. Because we're a guilt-innocence culture. Honor-shame isn't so important to us. But here, so what do I do whenever I come to your church? I bring greetings from my pastor, from the president of my organization. My president of my organization doesn't know what I'm doing. But if I don't say that, are you with me? Then people go, wow, you came all the way from America. You could at least bring us greetings from the president of his organization. Okay, so I do, out of respect for the culture. But none of that solves the shame problem.
For sure.
The shame's still there.
For sure.
I can wear the mayor's, I got the thing around my neck, and everybody's clapping for me when I walk in the room. Doesn't change the fact that I'm ashamed. And maybe I'm mayor because I am ashamed. Maybe if I become mayor, I won't feel ashamed anymore. I'll be in charge, right? Oh, you're a great man. Okay. None of those things solve the shame problem. How about fear? I want to control everything. Right? I must not fail. I want to glorify myself. Revere me. I want to take higher risks. I am the risk taker. I'm not afraid of anything. Really. I sometimes think people who do the most dangerous things are actually the most afraid. They're driven by their fear. Right? I'm going to overcome my fear by risking more. And those of us who are not driven by fear, all we can think is, are you crazy? A guy just died, a motorcycle daredevil, I don't know his name. He was getting and practicing for his world record motorcycle jump. He crashed and died yesterday. Now, he was probably motivated by money. But what's that about? I'm going to swim across the river where the crocodiles are. Okay. Why would you do that?